ask the question about sacrifices. Why would God want us to sacrifice an animal? That question is based on a misunderstanding of what a sacrifice really is, because the term sacrifice is a misnomer. It's supposed to be a translation of the Hebrew word korban. But the modern usage of the word sacrifice, when it's used in other areas of life, implies that I'm doing something negative, doing something causes me to suffer or lose something, but in the interest of gaining something later. You sacrifice some benefits, you save money, and you're sacrificing. You're not spending on what you really would want to spend on, but you're sacrificing in order to save money, so later on you have more than what you need, or you have what you need. In that context, sacrifice means that something is being lost for some future gain. Well, that's not what a korban is, and that's not what the word korban means, in fact. A korban is not a sacrifice of an animal. We're destroying an animal because by destroying the animal, that will benefit us. Rather, the word korban comes from a root that means close. We get close to God. By bringing a korban, we're bringing ourselves close to God. And not just bringing ourselves close to God, we're bringing the animal close to God. And everything else that goes along with so-called sacrifice is actually being elevated. Even when we are eating food, even separate from the sacrifice of the korban, the whole idea of eating food is to take something that is physical, something that is not spiritual, and bring it close to God, elevate it. And that's why the Talmud says that a person who's an Am Ha'aretz, which we will have to translate in the context of that passage of the Talmud, as someone who is uncouth, someone who is very materialistic, hedonistic, a very earthy person, doesn't have any sophistication whatsoever, doesn't appreciate the spiritual aspects of life, that person should not be allowed to eat meat. Why not? Because eating meat, just like the korban, if it's done the right way, it's kosher meat, person recites a blessing beforehand, person eats it with a higher intention that he's going to use the energy in order to better serve God, to better study Torah and perform a mitzvah. In that case, you're elevating the animal. Otherwise, what right do we have to take the life of an animal? And if you really want to think about it, it applies not just to animals. Take the vegan or the vegetarian. What gives you a right to pluck an apple off a tree? You're killing the apple. Well, if I couldn't eat vegetation, then I would starve to death. Well, doesn't answer the question. Why do you have a right to destroy something for your own benefit? Who says your benefit trumps the life of the apple? So one would say, well, you'd have to eat fruits and vegetables that already fell off the tree. They're no longer alive. But you're still destroying something that isn't destroyed. And the answer is that because you're using it for something positive, you're actually elevating. You're not destroying. That's the whole concept of existence, where we take one level and we elevate it to a higher level. We take the inanimate, and that's elevated to vegetation to animal, an animal to human, and human to God. And by doing that, you're taking all of creation along with you. And that's the concept of a korban. By bringing the korban, you're bringing the whole world closer to God, yourself, and everything else that was involved in the offering of that korban. With this premise, we'll be able to understand an enigmatic law concerning the way a person designates an animal as a korban. The Talmud says that we shouldn't say korban, we shouldn't say LaHashem korban, to God is this korban. Rather, we should say korban LaHashem. The korban is for God. What's the difference? The syntax doesn't make much of a difference. In Hebrew, either way is fine. So the reason given is that if a person will say LaHashem to God and invoke God's name, and then not conclude the sentence for a sacrifice, for a korban, that would be saying God's name in vain. Now, why wouldn't the person conclude? So commentators explain, because it could be the person changed his mind. He doesn't want to declare it as a sacrifice, as a korban. I'm going back and forth to the word sacrifice, but I really mean korban. Or maybe the person will die suddenly. whatever the reason may be, the person will be left with saying God's name in vain. Therefore, you should say first Korban and then add God's name. That's a complete sentence. Then there's nothing in vain. But it's really hard to understand. It's enigmatic that it's so far-fetched that a person will start a sentence and not finish it when they intended to bring this Korban. They're all of a sudden going to change their mind. They're going to die all of a sudden. Everything could happen. It's possible, but it's so improbable. Why were they so conscientious about this? So we can propose three different explanations, three different answers. One answer is the idea of saying God's name in vain is not just a minor infraction. It's something that fundamentally upsets the whole idea of a korban. And that's why we have to go to extremes, even far-fetched extremes, because otherwise the whole concept of a korban is undermined. What is it? Let's try to understand. The 10 Commandments, the third commandment is not to bear God's name in vain. The Talmud tells us that when God uttered that third commandment, the whole world shook. Why did the world shake? It didn't shake when God said, don't commit murder. Murder undermines the world, the civilization. Theft undermines civilization. But when did the world tremble? The world trembled when God said, don't bear my name in vain. What's the logic behind that? The logic is, what is the force that gives way to existence? It allows existence to materialize. What's the animating force? It's the name of God. The name of God, the Tetragrammaton, has in it a word that means existence. In other words, God's name is the force that is responsible for existence. If you mess up and disrespect God's name, you're undermining the very force of existence. The whole world trembles because its force that gives it life, it gives it existence, is now being upset. Well, what's the whole idea of a korban? The whole idea of a korban is to bring, as we said before, to bring the person and everything that the person involves in the offering of the korban closer to God. And why is it so important? It seems that the Torah puts such an emphasis on the korban because just like food, the korban is referred to as God's bread, God's food. God, of course, doesn't have to eat. But what is the metaphor of a food? If we wouldn't eat food, what would happen? Our soul would leave our body. The food is there to bring the soul into the body and keep it there. When a person is famished, the person loses energy, withdraws partially from this world. And if a person goes a long time without eating, the soul leaves the body permanently. The same way, when we bring a korban, we're getting closer to God, God gets closer to us as well. It's a reciprocal process. We're getting closer to God. We're bringing the world closer to Him. The whole world is being involved in this process of a korban, not just the immediate surroundings that involve the korban, but the whole world is being brought closer to God. And God gets closer to us, and He finds His presence in this world, animating this world. If you mess with God's name, the powerful force that gives the world its existence, it's the same thing as messing with a korban. The korban will not accomplish what it has to affect. That's why you have to be very careful to make sure that in the process of a korban, which the objective is to bring God into this world, and to bring God in this world not just in a hidden way, but in a revealed way, you have to go to extremes in avoiding upsetting the balance between God's name and this world. And that's why you have to say it in a way that God's name cannot potentially be violated. That's one approach. Another approach, why does a person sin? Well, let's ask a more fundamental question. What sins do require bringing a korban? Many people you would hear say that the only way we can get atonement is by bringing a korban. And now that we don't have sacrifices, because the Beis Hamikdash, the Holy Temple, was destroyed, we don't have atonement. That's nonsense. Korban was not brought for every sin. It was only brought for certain sins, and even those sins, in almost every case, it's for unintentional, unwitting transgression. If a person unwittingly transgressed the Shabbos, they have to bring a sin offering. If they do it deliberately, there is no sacrifice, there is no korban. So what's the idea behind that? You would think that if you have to bring an atonement for unintentional, you would certainly have to bring for intentional. And the answer is no. In one respect, unintentional is more serious a problem than intentional sins. Why? When a person does an intentional sin, what does that mean? That means that you have a struggle, you have an evil inclination. The evil inclination tempts you to do something, and you have a good inclination that says, no, don't do it. And there's a battle, there's a struggle, and we're human, so some of the battles we win, and some we lose. When a person does something that is wrong, it means that I lost that battle. And that's not an excuse. Just because it's a battle, it's not an excuse for you losing it. And you have to atone for it. But it has nothing to do with the sacrifice, nothing to do with the animal. But when you do something unwitting, unintentional, what does that mean? It means that you're desensitized, that you don't even realize that you're doing something wrong. It's not that you're deliberately, consciously, militantly doing something wrong. It's just you don't care. You know, it was the famous joke about, they asked the person, which is worse, ignorance or indifference? And he says, I don't know and I don't care. Well, that's what an unintentional sin is. I don't know what I'm doing, and I don't care really. And therefore, the only way you can atone for it is to resensitize you because you're suffering from desensitization that is caused by the animal soul within each and every person that covers up the godly soul's sensitivity. The godly soul by nature is sensitive to every little nuance of goodness and holiness and godliness. The animal soul by nature is sensitive only to that which interests its own desires and its own needs. And therefore, when your animal soul covers up, you become desensitized. And when you become desensitized, you are prone to degenerate into who knows what. And that's why the offering, the korban, had to be an animal in most cases, because the idea behind that is that you're taking that physical animal and you're using that animal to take your own personal, internal animal to become closer to God, which means, in another language, to become sensitive, to become aware, to become focused. That's the whole principle of a korban. If you bring a korban and you sacrifice, here I'm using the sacrifice advisedly, you sacrifice your sensitivity. You're saying it in a way where the sensitivity could be diminished because you're saying God's name and you're not thinking, maybe by saying God's name, I'm going to be capable of saying his name in vain. There's a possibility. So there's a slight, very slight measure of insensitivity. But you know what? Insensitivity, even the slightest insensitivity, is like being a little bit pregnant because it builds on itself and it gets worse and worse till finally people are capable of doing horrible things. Look what happened in the Holocaust. You're talking about law-abiding citizens, people who were basically decent people, you could say, but they were not sensitive to what was going on. And it started off being not sensitive, and they didn't protest against what the Germans were doing, what the Nazis were doing. But then from the lack of sensitivity, in a small way, in a minuscule way, it grew and it grew to the point where you could massacre 6 million people, men, women, and children, mercilessly, and you could just dismiss it as if, well, that's life, big deal. You're now no longer sensitive. So that's why the Torah was so concerned not to lose a little bit of that sensitivity. Then there's a third approach one could offer, why it is that the Torah was so concerned that you should not say God's name in vain and rather say a korban to God rather than to God a korban. And this is when a person is in the process of getting close to God, there's always a possibility that the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse in us, will throw in a monkey wrench and say, you want to get close to God? God is beyond everything. God is transcendent. God is infinite. We are finite creatures. How could we get close to something infinite? It is impossible. And that's a good logical argument. And therefore, it deters a person from trying to get close to God, because you find out, you discover in your own mind that God is elusive. But that's not true. The same God who is transcendent, the same God who is beyond anything in creation, and for whom creation doesn't even register. It's as if he did nothing. The Talmud says, where we see God's greatness, we see his humility. To us, creation is greatness. Wow, God created a whole universe, a vast universe. But for God, it's his humility. He lowered himself to be involved in creating. But he did create, and he did lower himself, and he is present within creation. God is transcendent, but he's also immanent. He's also within creation. He's accessible. He is in a position where he wants us to get close to him, and he wants to get close to us. This is what a korban is all about. When a person starts off with saying, to God, a korban, he's putting God on a pedestal. That's a very nice thing to do. But he's using it in a distorted way, in a perverted way, coming from the Yetzer Hara, from the evil impulse, putting God on a pedestal as if to say, I can't reach him, I can't get close. God is beyond everything, and therefore it's useless to bring a korban. And a person with that attitude, that korban is not very effective. Rather, the person has to say, korban, I'm getting close to God. Closeness to God is available to me. It's accessible to me. It's very possible, as it says in the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy near the end, it's very close to you, exceedingly close, in your mouth, in your heart to do it, which means that you can get close to God in all three areas of endeavor, your thoughts, your speech, and your action. You can get close to God. And that's why we start off with the word korban, to establish, yes, we are capable of getting close. We're on the threshold of the coming of Mashiach, and we have to work on these three areas. The first area, we said before, the reason why the person should not say God's name first, because there is a possibility remote that he might undermine God's name. What does that tell us? That we have to develop a greater respect and reverence for God's name. How do we accomplish that? By studying the Torah that describes to us what God's name is all about. These teachings can be found mostly in Hasidic philosophy, especially Chabad Hasidic philosophy, devoting hundreds of volumes to explain what it means that we have a connection to God's name. What is God's name? And to develop an understanding and appreciation for God's name, and not to take it in a way that's we're indifferent to it. We have to study that part of Torah. The same thing is true about sensitivity. To develop sensitivity, which is the whole objective of the korban, to recognize what we did was a lack of sensitivity, and to get us closer to God by realizing what God is to us and be more sensitive. Again, it's Torah that conditions us to be sensitive. Torah has the power to change the way we think. And when we study Torah, we can transform ourselves from insensitive beings to sensitive beings. But then the third point, third objective, that we should know that God is accessible to us. That same thing is true with redemption. A person shouldn't think redemption is elusive. We're never going to be redeemed. We're not worthy. We're not capable. And the message that we take from this story over here of the Korban is that, no, God is accessible to us, and the redemption that he promised us is accessible.